Nintendo Switch is quickly becoming a dream console for RPG fans, and with the release of Triangle Strategy, we might just have another classic. For now, Triangle Strategy is a Switch exclusive, a true grid-based strategy RPG in the vein of Tactics Ogre on Super NES or Final Fantasy Tactics on PlayStation 1. The game pays tribute to the absolute best in the SRPG space, but much like Square Enix's work on Octopath Traveler, a more traditional top-down style RPG in the mold of Final Fantasy VI, Triangle Strategy instead adds a modern twist to the strategy RPG. Thanks to Unreal Engine 4's feature set, tricks like depth of field, god rays, and ambient shading combine with more traditional 2D sprite work. It creates a glorious mixture of old and new, a hybrid style. So just how does it look and run on Switch? And is it a fitting tribute to the classic SRPGs that came before it? Let's find out. To take it from the very start, Triangle Strategy is, well, a strategy role-playing game from developers Square Enix and ArtDink. It's produced by Tomoya Asano, best known for his more recent work on Bravely Default in 2012 and of course Octopath Traveler in 2018. There's a stylistic through line in his work for sure, reviving older RPG design conventions with modern visuals, a style that's been dubbed 2D HD. Character illustrations, on the other hand, come courtesy of Akihiko Yoshida, whose exhaustive credits stretch back to Tactics Ogre and more recently games like the excellent Nier and Final Fantasy XIV. The high pedigree behind the project is clear. The goal though? To create a spiritual successor to the strategy games of old, in particular the PS1 classic Final Fantasy Tactics, from which it borrows a lot of its design elements. I've mentioned Final Fantasy Tactics a few times already, and for good reason. For context, Final Fantasy Tactics released in 1997, just as the mainline series hit a kind of commercial milestone with Final Fantasy VII. FF7 was, of course, a blockbuster moment for PS1, and so interest at the time was sky high for anything to do with the series, even an offshoot like Tactics. Sadly, the original PS1 release of Tactics only received a US localization, and so, for UK-based Final Fantasy fans, like myself, this really was an import job. And playing it for the first time, the visual style, the world, even the localization, felt entirely different to FF7's. Yes, potions, elixirs, summons, and chocobos gave it a link to Final Fantasy lore, but clearly the game had a very different discipline to game design. Its story, for a start, was more formal in tone, focused on warring kingdoms, nobility, and the power struggles therein. The presentation was entirely different too. The pre-rendered backdrops, the 3D models that defined FF7, were replaced with the inverse method, fully 3D environments, while the characters were displayed as sprites on a grid. So yes, back to Triangle Strategy, a game released 25 years after Tactics, and the visuals have obviously moved on. Triangle Strategy does take the same approach to its map design as its inspiration though. All the drama, the combat, even exploration, is contained to these 3D chessboard-like arenas built on tiles. There's a stylish hard cut to the perimeter of each area, where you see the world map sprawl out to the horizon. And much like Octopath Traveler's use of Unreal Engine 4, a shallow depth of field creates this distinctive effect of tilt-shift photography. A high-quality depth of field like this was obviously never possible on PS1 with Tactics, but here it results in all sprites, all world detail, looking like miniature models. Actually, in this sense, we also see a similar trick in the upcoming Diofield Chronicle, just announced. Here we have another big Square Enix strategy RPG announced for PC, PlayStation, Xbox consoles and Switch coming next year, so it'll be interesting to see where they take this idea next. The basics of Triangle Strategy's combat are straightforward and should be familiar to any fans of Tactics Ogre or Fire Emblem. Within a turn, you get to move a character across the battlefield and then make your attack of choice. There are some twists to the formula though. So for example, a pincer attack on an enemy results in extra damage doled out by a nearby ally player. Each character also offers a unique set of abilities too. Your options grow as the game progresses, but each has their pros and cons. The camera is user controlled, much like Final Fantasy Tactics, but you have the option to pan around with fine increments of movement too, rather than at fixed angles. The basic template is exactly what we'd expect then, but the delivery on a visual level is something else. Texture work on the tiled terrain are pixelated, almost by design to blend in with the sprites. But just as with Octopath Traveler, dynamic shadows and ambient shading are used to add depth, cast by the sprites and geometry. There's atmospheric scattering to simulate clouds passing overhead, god rays are used sparingly, there's even a form of cloth simulation on flags planted across towns. Also, we're treated to fully shaded water that has light refracting realistically onto nearby geometry. All combined, there's no other SRPG looking quite like this. The choice to blend 2D sprites with modern rendering techniques works. Even so, there are a few drawbacks to engaging all these visual effects on Switch. Notably, you'll see the sprites appear a touch blurry at times, especially playing Switch on a TV. The choice to adopt Unreal Engine 4 to apply taxing settings on Nintendo's handheld means a kind of compromise is in place in overall native resolution. In battle, that means the core gameplay renders at between 1280 by 720 and 1600 by 900 as a result, with a 30 FPS target while docked. On the plus side, we get crisp 1080p menus overlaid during battle, while the artwork is gorgeously presented for each character. As for handheld play on Switch, well, that resolution range lowers to a 720p maximum target, as you'd expect, with dynamic resolution scaling pushing image quality down at worst to 1066 by 600. For anyone coming from Octopath Traveler, the Unreal Engine features will be familiar, and likewise, the trade-off Square Enix makes in overall image quality to achieve them on Switch. In some respects, I almost wish we could instead have a clean, no-frills version of the game. No depth of field, no ambient occlusion, just the raw sprites presented on a clean 3D grid. Just to make the action more legible, having a pure 1080p rendering of a battle would have helped hugely too. But then, in doing all of that, we'd likely trade out the game's key visual hook, with its depth of field, AO and more. Also, on the performance side, it's worth noting the game runs at 30 FPS and does it extremely well. There are very occasional frame pacing issues in hitting this 30 FPS cap, far less regular than it is in Octopath Traveler. So on balance, the performance side is a success. You might notice a big hiccup just after initiating a big move, but again, since most of gameplay unfolds from a static camera angle, it's hardly a major gripe. A big final highlight of the game so far is in its story, its dialogue. Since the backdrops are limited to these small chessboard-like arenas, the dialogue has a lot of heavy lifting to do to tell its story. To sweeten the deal, most of the text is fully voice acted as well. Just as well too, its opening chapters are dense with exposition, but there is a payoff to it all. Free roaming sections are included, which was never an option in games like Final Fantasy Tactics, but here you're unshackled from the square grid to freely explore each small area, to talk to villagers, find treasure, and gather clues. Exploration is rewarded, and every snippet of info you get makes a difference. Actually, one major early decision relies heavily on these clues, to convince other party members into a majority vote on where to go next.
It is time to cast our votes. Do we journey to the Grand Duchy of Esfrost, or the Holy State of Hyzant?
The final result with Triangle Strategy is a satisfying tribute to Final Fantasy Tactics. With the added freedom to explore, the voice acting, and the suite of Unreal Engine enhancements, It's a fine modern take on the formula. It looks gorgeous, the story is rich, and opens up plenty of branching pathways too. As for the game's delivery on Switch, the only snag is that image quality is a touch blurry viewed on a big screen. Still, that aside entirely, this is a real nostalgia trip for fans of Super NES or PS1 RPGs. One that may not be for everybody, but if you have the time and patience to take in its story, learn its rules, you're in for a real treat. But that's all from me today. If you did enjoy this quick look at Triangle Strategy, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly, just use Twitter. But from me for now, thanks for watching.